No mai haere mai, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to the 15th webinar for LDAC. This is the first one of the year. Today we're going to be looking at how and when to design purpose provisions and statements of principle in a way that genuinely helps the legislation work well in practice. The supplementary material that sits behind this session exists, but our focus is broader. What good legislative design looks like for lawyers and policy professionals working on bills before drafting instructions are settled. In our webinar today, we will cover when a purpose clause is useful, where to begin when shaping one, the main types of purpose clauses, common risks, and when a statement of principle may be a better tool than using a purpose statement. Before we go on, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Guy Beatson and I'm going to be the facilitator of today's webinar. I'm Deputy Chair and a non-public service member of LDAC. I'm a freelance governance, leadership and policy advisor, having previously been the General Manager of the Governance Leadership Centre at the Institute of Directors, and having had a long career in the public service and senior leadership roles across social, environmental and economic sector agencies. Now I'd like to ask our panel today to introduce themselves. Perhaps we could get Alison go first, please.
Morena, I'm Alison Bennett. I'm one of the public service members of LDAC, and in my day job, I'm Director Legal at MB Legal Team.
Thanks, Alison. And introducing Polly Higby.
Kia ora koutou, I'm Polly Higby. I'm a public service member of LDAC and I'm a senior Crown Counsel at Crown Law, where we do a lot of public law advice and litigation, and so purpose provisions are bread and butter of our day jobs.
Yeah, so thanks, Polly and Alison, for joining me today. It would be a lonely existence without a panel, and much more boring for our audience, I suspect, as well. There are three parts to our webinar today. First, I'm going to talk briefly about what LDAC is to set the scene. That's because this is our first webinar for the year, and just to make sure that everybody knows what LDAC is and what it does. Then we'll have a discussion about purpose and principle clauses with our panel. And then we'll open up to you, the audience, for questions and answers. But also in doing that, please don't wait until the end of the webinar to ask any questions you have. If you have them, please use the Q&A button at the top of your screen, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we possibly can towards the end of the webinar. So before we get into the webinar itself, I'd like to talk briefly about LDAC, what it is, and how LDAC can help you as policy and legal advisors. The Legislation Design Advisory Committee is made up of members appointed by the Attorney-General to support good legislative design. There's a mix of public service and non-public service members, and we've got both of those in our webinar today. All members are voluntary or unpaid for their LDAC work. In the case of the public sector employees, their time is loaned by their employer. PCO provides secretariat support, which we're eternally grateful for, including advisors and support to the committee. Members have a broad range of backgrounds, as you'd expect. We draw on members from legal and policy teams within departments, Crown entities, as well as academics, lawyers, barristers and consultants like myself. A broad range of skills and experience is important because good legislative design is multidisciplinary, as we'll find through today. It's not just about the law. LDAC has three functions. We publish and maintain the legislation guidelines and supplementary material, some of which we'll talk about today. That's the government's handbook for good legislative design. The most recent edition was updated in 2021, but the guidelines have a decades-long history and are a direct successor of the Legislation Advisory Committee guidelines. We carry out education and engagement activities, like this session today, but also by department and by issue. Both these activities extend our reach beyond advice functions. It's common to see submissions to select committees refer to the guidelines, and ministers are required to address consistency with the guidelines and cabinet papers for bills. Our advice function applies at two different stages, you can see in the slide. The bulk of our work is prior to introduction, when we advise departments that come to us through subcommittees on various bills or prospective bills. But we also make submissions to select committees. And just a word on what the focus of LDAC is. We aim to support good lawmaking, and that's along with colleagues in other agencies, including the Ministry of Regulation. We are guided by the guidelines and the supplementary material that we've produced. The guidelines are not about policy. Can't stress that enough. They are not about policy. They're about expression of policy in law. This means you will not find us giving an opinion on the policy that's presented as part of the consideration with the LDAC subcommittee. It's all about the legislation itself and its design. And it's important to remember that the guidelines are just that, they're guidelines. These are not rules that must be followed, and we'll cover some of that in our webinar today as well. Our goal is to help ensure that conscious design choices are being made in legislation. Now, having said all of that, and with that brief introduction, let's get into the substance of our webinar today. And we've got a really great panel, and we're grateful for them to share their insights and wisdom. So the starting point for us today is when to use a purpose clause and where to start when you're designing them. So if we could start with Alison, could you introduce what a purpose provision actually is for our audience, please?
Sure. A purpose provision is an express statement that helps explain what an act or part of an act is for. Sometimes it can be short and functional, and other times it can be broader and more directional. The important thing, though, is that having a purpose provision is a conscious design choice. It's not a standard clause that has to be dropped in every single time. As we all know, a legislation's purpose should be clear. A clear purpose helps readers to decide whether the legislation is relevant to them and to understand it and navigate it. A purpose clause is one way of making the purpose of an act clear. Purpose matters whether or not it is set out expressly in the Act. Under Section 10 of the Legislation Act, legislation is interpreted through its text in light of its purpose and context. So the practical question is not, does purpose matter, but rather, will an express clause help people to understand and apply this regime better? That's especially relevant for this audience. Even if you're not drafting the bill yourself, you're helping to define the policy objective, shape the instructions to PCO, and test whether the legal machinery matches what Parliament's trying to achieve. A purpose provision can do several jobs. It can help orient readers at the outset when they first pick up an act. It can signal a policy direction. It can help guide the exercise of powers or discretions under the Act. And it can assist in interpretation. These are all quite different jobs, and it's worth being really clear about which one or which ones you want your purpose clause to do. It's also important to remember that purpose clauses have a legal effect on the nature of powers and duties under the legislation and on those who are tasked with implementing it. So the core message for today is really simple. A purpose clause can be useful, but only when it's anchored to the actual structure of the bill and drafted to perform a real function. It's never a substitute for clear policy design and clear and well thought through operative provisions.
And it's interesting too, isn't it? Because it relies on that clear policy design as well, right? And that's the critical thing about this. But I guess the interesting thing about some of these purpose clause things is you could have argued that sometimes they've become a bit of a fad. So if we can turn to Polly briefly, given your experience, we need some really clear guidelines about when we're going to use one of these things. So when should we use a purpose clause?
Picking up on Alison's point, a purpose clause should not be automatic. It earns its place only if it will do useful work in the regime. So a good discipline is to ask, what job is the clause meant to do? Is it mainly there to help readers navigate a complex scheme, to signal a policy shift, to guide the exercise of discretion, or to help with interpretation? Different answers point to different kinds of wording, and sometimes to no clause at all. For example, if the bill creates a new and detailed regulatory framework, a purpose clause may help operational users understand the shape of the regime before they get into the detail. And I think some people online will have had the experience of picking up a piece of legislation for the first time, wondering what it's about, and going to the purpose clause to orientate themselves. If the bill gives a decision maker significant discretion, a purpose clause may help keep those powers tied to the overall scheme and purpose of the Act. But if the operative provisions already make the objective and structure clear, a purpose clause may add very little. In some cases, it can create confusion by suggesting a broader or a different direction than the detailed provisions actually support. For policy teams, this becomes a useful diagnostic question. If you're struggling to say why the clause is needed, that may be a sign that the policy objective is still too vague or the regime design is not yet stable enough. In that sense, asking whether you need a purpose clause can expose issues much earlier in the process.
And thanks, Polly. I guess some of that goes back to what I was saying earlier in terms of my introduction, and that is we're not talking about the policy itself in this conversation. We're actually talking about whether or not that policy is clear enough, and therefore whether or not you need a purpose clause or not. So now we've got a situation where we understand what a purpose clause is, and we know when we should use one. Now we've got the really interesting question, which Alison's very well qualified, given she helps policy teams with this stuff all of the time, about where we should start when designing a purpose clause.
Thanks, Guy. The best place with this is not to start with the wording. It is, as in most things, legislation design. The best place to start is the policy problem in concrete terms. So consider, what is your bill trying to fix, change, enable, or protect? And what outcomes are you looking to produce? And importantly, what is outside scope of that as well? Next, you should move on to identify the function of the clause and be really clear about that. So is it there, as we traversed earlier, to orient readers, guide discretion, support interpretation, or signal a policy direction? If you can't answer that question clearly, then it's hard to justify the clause or draft it well. And then you need to move on to test the clause against your substantive provisions. And this is really important. You need to ensure that it's aligned well with those provisions. If the clause says the regime promotes safety, fairness, accountability, or well-being, where in the bill is that actually implemented? Which powers, duties, thresholds, or processes make that statement real? Audience also matters. So are you trying to assist a court, a regulator, departmental officials, regulated parties, or the public at large? The answer is going to affect both whether a clause is needed and just how specific it should be. And then a final useful check is, if you remove the purpose clause altogether, would your bill still be coherent and understandable? If the answer is yes, then the clause may still add value, but you should be able to explain exactly what that extra value is. And if the answer is no, then that may point to a deeper design issue in the bill itself.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking as you were saying that, Alison, I mean, my basic approach to these things is often to think about legislation as being a manual. And if you can't see that coherence in the way you've talked about, then actually it's probably not doing the job. And that's where purpose clauses come in as well. So just to pull all the threads together in terms of what Alison and Polly's talked about. The takeaway from this first section is that purpose is always a part of legislative interpretation and design. The real issue is whether stating it expressly will make the regime easy to understand, apply, or administer. And what we've heard from Alison and Polly is a practical sequence. Start with the policy problem, decide what the role the clause is meant to play, and then test whether the body of the bill actually supports what the clause says. And that is why this is not just a drafting question. It's a design question for anyone involved in developing legislation. That includes policy advisors as well as legal advisors. And asking this question early usually improves the regime as a whole, not just the front-end wording. This is about coherence of the legislation and its design, not just one piece of it. So that's all fine and dandy. We now know how to start, what this is, and what one of these things happens to be useful for. But there are different types of purpose clauses, and there are a bunch of risks. This is not just a one-way bet in terms of the benefits. So, Alison, building on what we've just talked about, what are the different types of purpose clauses?
Right. One useful way of thinking about different purpose clauses is to think about them by function. So some are mainly communicative. They simply tell a reader at a high level what the Act is about before they start working through the detailed provisions. So a good example of this type of provision is Section 3 of the Electronic Courts and Tribunals Act 2016, which largely just describes what the Act does in practical terms, facilitating the use and filing of permitted documents in courts and tribunals. But other purpose provisions can be more directional. They signal that Parliament wants the regime to move in a particular policy direction. That can be helpful, but it also raises the stakes because broader directional language can create more room for argument later. So a clear example of this type of provision is Section 4 of the Official Information Act, which is not just descriptive, but it articulates a policy direction, progressively increasing the availability of official information to support participation, accountability, respect for the law, and good government. Then a third group of provisions has a more concrete legal or administrative role. And these clauses may help to frame the exercise of powers, guide criteria, or support monitoring and accountability within a regime. So the Financial Markets Conduct Act 2013 is a useful example here. Its main and additional purpose provisions do more than just describe the regime. They help structure how the legislation operates and connect with decision-making powers elsewhere within the Act. And of course, every express purpose clause may have interpretative relevance, but some are framed in a way that makes that role much more important. It's helpful to picture a spectrum. At one end, you've got your narrow clauses that describe what the Act does. At the other end are your broader clauses that describe the outcomes it seeks to achieve. And most clauses sit somewhere in the middle. The broader they become, the more carefully they need to be tested against the operative provisions to ensure that you have that necessary alignment.
And those categories you've outlined are really useful. And the idea of having a spectrum, I think what we're getting into is the notion that says, well, on the surface of it, all these purpose clauses kind of are the same. But actually, in reality, in terms of what Alison's just talked about, there's a spectrum there that we need to be aware of. Now, having said that, I said this is not a one-way bet. It's not just all benefit from these purpose clauses, is it, Polly? So what are the risks to be aware of when designing a purpose clause?
The main risks are familiar, but they matter. First, a clause can be too vague or aspirational. It may sound impressive while offering little real help to the people who have to apply the legislation. Second, the clause can overpromise, and this is linked to the first issue. If it states outcomes that the substantive provisions cannot realistically deliver, it may create false expectations and distort how the regime is understood. Third, it can be asked to do too much work. If the real policy choices need to be expressed through thresholds, rights, obligations, enforcement tools, or review mechanisms, those things need to be in the body of the bill. A purpose clause cannot safely carry them on its own. And I can't stress that point enough, that operative provisions need to be in the operative parts of the Act as opposed to the purpose provisions. Fourth, broad wording may have unintended legal effects. Because purpose can influence interpretation and the exercise of discretion, an imprecise clause can shift the operation of the regime in ways the policy team did not anticipate. There's a really useful and recent example of this in a piece of litigation that ended in the High Court late last year. The case is called Climate Clinic Aotearoa Inc. and the Minister of Energy and Resources. For the lawyers amongst you, the citation is the New Zealand Supreme Court, the neutral citation 2025 197. The case is interesting because three courts, the High Court, the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court, interpreted the purpose provision in the Crown Minerals Act 1991 in quite different ways. So Climate Clinic challenged decisions to grant exploration permits under the Crown Minerals Act, arguing, amongst other things, that climate change was a mandatory relevant consideration. The consideration of the purpose provision and how that affected the decision-making powers was a key part and a key issue of this litigation. The statutory purpose was to promote prospecting for, exploration for and mining of Crown-owned minerals for the benefit of New Zealand. The key issue in this litigation was, well, what do those words for the benefit of New Zealand mean? The High Court held that the use of the phrase for the benefit of was simply Parliament's indication that it desired those activities, exploration, prospecting, mining, to take place precisely because they were for New Zealand's benefit. The High Court found that climate considerations were irrelevant, and if taken into account substantively, the decision maker would have acted unlawfully. The majority of the Court of Appeal agreed with the High Court's interpretation that the words for the benefit of were Parliament's assertion of a deemed fact. The majority in the Court of Appeal held climate considerations were not mandatory, but said it was unnecessary to decide if they were permissive considerations, so if the decision maker could have taken them into account. The minority judgment in the Court of Appeal held that climate considerations were permissive, but declined to express a view on whether climate considerations were mandatory, given they had been taken into account in this instance. The Supreme Court took an entirely different view and held that climate change was a mandatory relevant consideration. The Supreme Court's interpretation of the purpose provision was that the purpose is to promote mining only where doing so is for the benefit of New Zealand, and that opened the door for a range of considerations, including climate change considerations, to be taken into account. So the case is a really useful illustration of how purpose language can generate significant uncertainty. And if you think about that case, the fact that it went through all three levels of the senior courts, that sort of uncertainty really lasted for years for the parties involved. I'll very briefly mention one other case that I think is really important when it comes to understanding the effect that purpose provisions can have. That case is colloquially called TTRL. The full citation is Trans-Tasman Resources and Taranaki Whanganui Conservation Board, 2021, New Zealand Supreme Court 127. And it's an example of where a purpose provision was held to have operative force, creating what the majority in the Supreme Court called an environmental bottom line. And that really constrained in a previously not understood way the scope of the decision-making powers under the Act. And the case is, it's a really long one, but at the start there is a summary of the court's reasoning, so I commend that to you. And so that case is a significant example of the effect that purpose clauses can have on the exercise of discretionary powers. Finally, I'd say there is the problem of overload with purpose clauses. If every worthwhile aim is put into the clause, it becomes harder to tell what is central, what is secondary, and how tensions between those aims are supposed to be managed.
Thanks, Polly. And it's really good to have some really practical examples in terms of the interpretation and some of those risks in a really practical kind of way. Now, another sort of practicality in here is often we'll talk about these purpose clauses as if we're talking about legislation that's being drafted from the beginning. So it's a new piece of legislation, and you've got a purpose clause in there, and you follow through a range of the things we've talked about and manage some of those risks. But sometimes, and we've seen this with a range of LDAC subcommittees, you end up in situations where there's amendments to existing legislation which also has a purpose clause in it. So I want to turn to Alison because Alison's seen some pretty interesting examples of this. What are some risks to think about when updating an Act with a weak or outdated purpose clause?
Thanks, Guy. Yeah, from an LDAC perspective, we have from time to time seen agencies working on amendments where either they're paying too much attention to the purpose provision and trying to channel the vibe of their amendments through purpose provision with inadequate attention to the operative provisions, or equally they have forgotten about the existing purpose provision and are busily amending operative provisions to change the direction of the regime. So you just need to be aware when you're doing an amendment that you may not be working with a blank sheet in terms of purpose provisions. If you've got a purpose provision there, you need to be thinking about where it came from, what were its origins, and where are you going with your amendment. So the first step is to ask whether the existing clause still fits the scheme as it now operates, or as you're wanting it to operate going forward. If it still broadly fits, even if it's not perfect, the better course may be sometimes to leave well enough alone and just work carefully within the existing framework. But if the clause no longer reflects the structural direction of the legislation, and that can happen over time, the world moves on and sometimes legislative regimes don't keep up, then you need to actually be thinking about how you might amend the clause, especially if the mismatch is going to create confusion for the courts, decision makers, or regulated parties. But what you really want to avoid is layering new policy onto an old purpose clause that points in a different direction. That can leave your Act internally confused and inconsistent. So the practical approach is to assess whether the old clause remains coherent in the amended scheme, and if not, whether revising it will improve clarity more than it complicates the amendment exercise. And also, I mean, the key message throughout this webinar that we're trying to get across is just ensuring that you're constantly checking the alignment between your purpose provision and your operative clauses.
Yeah, that's right. So, and that's a really interesting thing, right? We're saying there should be operative clauses that actually give effect to the purpose of the legislation. But if you've actually got changes to it, and you're arguably trying to change the purpose or they're inconsistent, that alignment starts to become a real problem. Just before we go on, and I ask Polly to talk about some of those practical design tips and so on and so forth. If you've got questions, and I'm sure you do on the basis of what we've talked about so far, I know that I've got a few, please use the Q&A button at the top of the screen. That's the one next to the people with the question mark on it, and we'll take those questions when we get to them. So, we've talked about what this is and how it works, and we've talked about the risks and all the other things to do with purpose clauses, and we've highlighted a couple of those. So, Polly, can I turn to you and ask you what sort of practical design tips and examples would you offer our audience today?
A good practical question is whether the proposed clause sounds like legislation or like a policy speech. If it reads more like a strategy document than a legal provision, it probably needs more discipline. So here's a narrow example. The purpose of this Act is to establish a licensing and monitoring regime for commercial drone operators. That's a functional clause that tells the reader what the Act does. Here's a slightly broader version. The purpose of this Act is to promote safe and responsible use of commercial drones by establishing a licensing, monitoring and enforcement regime. This adds a policy outcome, but it still links that outcome to the legal machinery. And here's a version that arguably may be too broad unless the bill, the operative provisions, genuinely support it. The purpose of this Act is to foster innovation, public confidence, community wellbeing and world-leading standards in the use of commercial drones. Those may be worthy aspirations, but each extra idea needs to be tested against what the bill actually does. So the practical lesson is to treat every added concept as a challenge question. Where is this implemented? How will it help a reader? And what legal work is it expected to do? And going back to the point made earlier in the seminar, using that test of if we took away the purpose clause, is it still clear how those purposes are achieved in the operative provisions? That's a good method. Also, keep in mind that sometimes another tool, instead of a broad purpose clause, might be a principles provision that tells decision makers what considerations should guide the way the regime is applied. The final point that I'd make in terms of practical tips is particularly if you're legislating in a contested area, and that might be because it's a contested big picture policy area or because it's a regulatory regime where you know that there are different participants potentially with quite different interests, is to play the devil's advocate. How would you use this purpose clause to advance your particular take on what you hope decision makers might do under the Act?
Yeah, that's right. So actually applying those practical tests is the key, right? So what we've done in this section is talk about the different sorts of purpose clauses, talked about those risks in a range of ways and giving you a few practical tips to go on with. So the key message from what we've just talked about and heard from Alison and Polly is there's no single ideal form of a purpose clause. There's much more richness in that than you might think. The right form depends on the job the clause is meant to do in the regime. We've also seen the trade-off. The broader and more ambitious the clause, the more carefully it needs to be checked against the actual legal machinery of the bill, particularly in the way that Polly's just talked about. For policy teams and departmental lawyers, the practical discipline is to test the clause against the whole design of the regime. If it is broader than the bill, vaguer than the policy, or doing work that should sit elsewhere, more design work is needed before the wording is settled. And just a further word, we've got a few questions, but we could do with a few more. So if you've got questions, pop them in the question and answer part of the system using the Q&A button at the top of the screen. So Polly started to talk a little bit about statements of principle. So if we're moving on, we need to talk about what those things are and how they work. So, but like the purpose clause stuff, Alison, can you tell us what a statement of principle actually is?
Sure. A statement of principle is a related but distinct tool from a purpose provision. It usually does not tell you at a high level what the Act is for, but rather it identifies some considerations, values or norms that should guide how the regime operates or how particular powers are exercised under it. A useful shorthand is a purpose clause answers the "what is this Act for" question, whereas a principles provision more often answers the "what matters should guide decisions made under this Act." It's not a rigid distinction, but it is quite a practical one. So an example of a statement of principle is Section 156C of the Telecommunications Act. So that Section 156B sets out a range of enforcement actions that the Commission can take in certain circumstances. Section 156C sets out what matters the Commission must take into account when deciding what enforcement action to take. So it's an example of a provision that guides decision making at a very practical level. Statements of principle can be helpful where decision makers have to balance competing considerations and exercise judgment over time, or keep certain interests visible throughout the operation of the regime. And Section 156 is an example of that kind of provision. For advisors, this distinction helps to avoid two common mistakes that we see. One is making a purpose clause do too much, or using a principles provision where what is really needed is a clearer substantive rule or decision-making test elsewhere in the bill.
Yeah, I really like what we're doing today because it's actually really, really practical. There's a way of kind of working through some of the things you've just talked about in terms of understanding the difference even between those statements of principle and the purpose clause stuff as well. So I guess we're in that world that says now we know what one of these things is. I'm going to turn to Polly. And when should we use a statement of principle?
A statement of principle is most useful where the regime needs to guide judgment or discretion on an ongoing basis. That's common where officials, regulators, tribunals, or other decision makers must weigh a number of interests rather than simply apply a bright line rule. It can also be useful where Parliament wants certain considerations to remain visible throughout the regime, not just in an opening statement. That might include transparency, proportionality, long-term effects, or the interests of affected persons. So if your real concern is how discretion should be channeled, rather than what the Act is for at a high level, a principles provision may be the better fit. A simple example might be, in performing functions and exercising powers under this Act, decision makers must have regard to transparency, proportionality, and the long-term interests of consumers. That provides ongoing guidance without trying to summarise the whole purpose of the Act. But the same functional test still applies. If the principles will not guide real decisions, or if the operative provisions already do the job fully, the provision may be unnecessary.
So I think we've got a common theme in here. If you don't need it, don't use it, which is kind of useful advice in the middle of it. Having said that, I mean, I suspect we've also got the same issue with statements of principle, which is you might use them and there might be some benefits, but it's not a one-way street. So do you want to talk a bit more, Polly, about the risks associated with these statements of principle?
Yeah. They're the same as what we've discussed for purpose clauses. So vagueness, overbreadth, weak fit with the rest of the regime, and the temptation to rely on a high-level provision instead of doing the necessary work in the substantive rules. So often this can just defer having the argument about the trade-offs that are being made under the regime if that isn't fully worked out in the policy process. If the principles are expressed too generally, decision makers may not know how to apply them in concrete cases. That creates uncertainty at the operational level and can shift unresolved policy choices into administration or litigation.
Yeah, and that's kind of important in the midst of this. It might crystallise a few conflict issues and part of the policy design stuff too, I suspect. Alison, do you have any further views on these risks with these principles of the statements of principle?
Yeah, sure. There's a risk of internal tension creeping in. So if you've got several principles pointing in different directions, and the bill gives no structure for managing that tension, then the provision may generate uncertainty rather than guidance. And often that's just a lack of clarity about the policy problem and objective. So as always, go back to that and be clear about what are you trying to solve and where are you wanting to take this. And again, if a principle is important enough to shape outcomes under the Act, the operative provisions also need to give it concrete expression. So again, it's that follow through and alignment with the operative provisions that's critical to making these things workable.
Yeah, I think there's a common theme in all of this, though, too, which is about these purpose provisions and principle provisions have to guide stuff, but there's actually got to be something that they actually do. So just to pull this section together on statements of principle, the key message is that statements of principle are not simply a softer version of a purpose clause. They're a different tool used to guide ongoing judgments, discretion, and balancing within a regime. They can be very useful when Parliament wants decision makers to keep considerations in view, but they still need to be concrete enough to guide real decisions and closely connected to the rest of the legislation. I think that's a bit of a common theme with purpose clauses as well. So We've now worked through the key pieces in terms of purpose clauses and principle statements of principle. Now I'm going to open it up to the questions from our audience today. Again, if you've got questions, don't wait. Use the Q&A button at the top of the screen and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. So I thought I might turn to both of you actually, and we'll start with Alison. How do you handle multiple purposes that may pull in different directions in legislation?
Same principle we've mentioned a few times, just being clear at the outset what your policy problem is. To keep coming back to that throughout your legislative design process. And there may be subsets of issues, just being clear about how all the multiple bits of a regime fit together and ensuring that you can actually make sense of the overall piece.
What's your thinking about that, Polly?
I think, I guess, doing a thought experiment of if you are a decision maker under this Act and you have a discretion that you need to exercise, and you have been presented by Parliament and the legislation with purposes that pull against each other. The question for the drafter and the policy team behind it is to say, well, how do we want that decision maker to resolve that tension? Is there something they should weigh more highly? Is it totally up to them what the balance is? And to indicate that somewhere in the Act as to how that is supposed to be resolved. So think about it from that practical perspective. How do you want the question to be answered if it comes up before the decision maker?
Yeah, it certainly got me wondering in terms of the coherence of the policy in the first place. Too, if this was a new piece of legislation and you had purpose provisions or across bits of a piece of legislation actually pulling in different directions, your policy might be slightly incoherent in the middle of that as well. And that danger is even worse, I think. You might like to comment on this, Alison, in those circumstances where you've got you're amending existing legislation and arguably asking the legislation to do some other things. Do you have a view about that?
I think that's right, and that's the kind of example we've seen before LDAC before, where an act is the environment that an act operates in has moved on, and the act no longer operates. The settings no longer align with reality, or where policy direction is very deliberately being moved from the original expression of purpose. And it's just about going back and revisiting that purpose and ensuring that you're very clear about where the Act is going to land, where you want it to land, and how that is expressed through both the purpose provision and the operational provisions. And if you're making quite a deliberate change, making sure that change not only is reflected in the purpose provision, but in all of the original operative provisions as well as your new operative provisions, so that you're not leaving decision makers and others left, trying to resolve insurmountable tensions in the provisions and the statements of purpose.
Well, that's really interesting. Yeah. There you go, Polly.
So I was going to add, it may also not be a problem with the policy. It might be that the policy is quite clear, but actually there are some exceptions, and the exceptions have a different, purpose, and there is reason for that. And an example which just at a very general level is that you might have an act that sets up a regulatory regime, but then the ability for some kind of exemption to be granted from that. And that's always an interesting question, because when you think, well, how should that exemption be exercised? And the authorities tell us, well, the exemption needs to be exercised with the purpose in mind, but the purpose is pulling the other way. So then you have to think, well, what was Parliament's intent in creating an exemption or an exceptions regime? And that can happen in a lot of acts and a lot of regulatory regimes. And so one way around that is to be very clear with there are exemptions for this purpose and to explain it. And then the other thing I would say is that purpose, of course, is not just found in the purpose provision, it's in the scheme of the Act, but also people who are applying this legislation, whether it is the kind of business as usual job or in the context of legal advice or litigation, will also look at things like the explanatory note. They'll look at the Hansard speeches, and often what I find is really helpful is the departmental reports. The jury's still out on the extent to which courts might look at those, but in terms of understanding what the reasoning was, they can be really good sources of information, and all of a sudden you read something going, oh, now I understand. So using all of those tools to make it clear why there might be some kind of exception or why the policy might pull in a different direction, that can help decision makers. Yeah.
Yeah, and we're going to come back to that explanatory note piece in respect of another question we've got, but I just want to turn to you briefly, Polly, to pick up on the point you were making about court interpretation. And so one of our audience today is asking, how much weight should policy teams put on how a court might later use a purpose clause?
Um, a bit, but don't let it paralyze you, because you'll never be able to anticipate every single scenario. And sometimes anywhere that you have discretion, there is that risk that there is a disagreement about how that discretion has been used. So I think, think about it, and particularly if it's a contentious area, if it's been the subject of litigation before, if you can see something on the horizon, then that's the point at which to go and get legal advice and say, well, how might a court interpret this? Yeah.
But I guess it's not just interpreting it in the context of the clause alone. When the point you've both made through the course of our discussion today is that the operative provisions matter here too. So that also helps that interpretation. So while we're on interpretation, Alison, Holly's talked a bit about explanatory notes. We've got a question about explanatory notes, and a question about whether or not they could or should be amended to maintain consistency with how the purpose provisions are changed from over time as well. Or are those explanatory notes just historic record? What's your view of that?
I think that they form part of the historic record. Obviously, there are other places in the legislative process where some changes in policy direction or thinking might occur. So for example, the Select Committee's report, if there's a substantive change being made at that point from the way the bill was framed at introduction. So it's a case of tracking through the legislative process, like ministers' speeches, Hansard record of the debate in the committee of the whole. All of those things will help you navigate the way that the policy might have, and the way it's framed in the bill might have evolved from the point of introduction to the point of enactment.
And the amendment bill itself will have an explanatory note.
Yes, but it's interesting too. The question is fascinating in terms of trying to explain the totality of a piece of legislation, albeit with the amendment. I mean, part of the problem here is that from a policy perspective, and I'm guilty of this as much as anybody, you kind of focus on that amending piece of policy, but you don't necessarily stand back and go, actually, what's the policy frame for this legislation as a whole? And if it changes, or you follow through some of the stuff that Alison particularly was talking about in terms of amending legislation, where you actually arguably change some of the purpose provisions from the original law. Interesting to think about how you pick that up. Do you have a view about that, Polly?
I think I'm not sure if this directly relates to your question. I was kind of thinking again about the previous question of how much to worry about the purpose and that bigger point about translating the policy into law. And really, when you think about what courts are doing, and everybody who's involved in that process, everybody in good faith is trying to say, well, what is Parliament's intent? And how do I implement that in this scenario? And so thinking about the purpose provision and how you're framing the legislation, because scheme and purpose go hand in hand, is about translating that intent into something, as you say, Guy, that can be used as a manual for people who then actually have to apply the legislation.
Yeah, no, it's really good. I'm enjoying this conversation because I think there's some really real gold in terms of what you both talked about, particularly what you've just said, Polly. I guess, Alison, you have a lot to do in your work at MB with secondary legislation as well as primary legislation. The Legislation Design Advisory Committee is mostly focused on the primary legislation piece of this, of course. But I think one of our audience today has raised a really interesting point about how purpose clauses impact the making of secondary legislation, and how the purpose statements and so on play through in terms of that secondary legislation. Do you want to give us a bit of a view about how you see that playing through?
I mean, the important thing to note there is that the authorising provisions for the making of your secondary legislation will need to be interpreted in light of your purpose provision and your primary act. So it's at a legislative design point when you're actually creating the regulation making power. Just be clear about how you think that the purpose provision and the way it's framed might impact on what you think you need at a secondary legislation level, and just ensuring that the authorising provisions are going to give you what you need. And Parliamentary Counsel are really helpful when it comes to designing authorising provisions, so they're always a good source of advice.
That's really good. I mean, but it also just has to follow that scheme, of course. That's the critical thing about it. I mean, just like
That's
any
right.
other interpretation of this stuff, you can't do anything in secondary legislation that's not authorised in some fashion or consistent with the primary legislation in the first place. Um, Polly, you mentioned some ways of framing some of these purpose clauses, and we've got a question from a member of our audience talking about threats to maritime security, and then contrasting that with the fact that there might be an evolving threat landscape, for example. What's your view about how to frame these purpose clauses, from that level of kind of generality at some level to something that's much narrower, possibly much more immediate that might need to be changed? How do you balance all of that up?
Without seeing the question, I think that I'm kind of loath to say this. There is always the option of having a particular purpose clause for a part if there is
Mhm.
something that you're really concerned about. You need to think really carefully about how to reconcile that with the main purpose clause. But if you can see that there is an evolving risk or a threat that you are concerned about, then I guess, the first question would be, well, should there be some operative provisions that enable decision makers to deal with that risk? Um, and that in itself might be enough. Maybe you have a part with its own purpose clause. But on that general point about, well, things are evolving, how can we make sure that this legislation stays current? Again, I think, courts, and there are principles of statutory interpretation about kind of an ambulatory approach with your legislation that courts try to still make legislation work and not stand still. And again, I think, it is, people do try and apply it with good faith to make it work if it is possible to do so. But it is, I think I wouldn't underestimate, I certainly do not envy the drafters who are involved in doing these clauses and the policy teams behind them. It is really difficult stuff. Yeah.
But I guess some of what you talked about means not having these purpose clauses do too much work either. There's a range of ways in which you could take this example of the threats to maritime security. You could have some periodic statements of threats to maritime security published by the minister, or so, yeah, and it's fair to say that some of the security services now are doing some of that already. Do you have a view about this, Alison?
I mean, I think it's a really interesting question because it's a thing that we have seen play out a lot with disruptive technological developments and that have impacts for regulatory regimes. We've had several of those sort of come before us over recent years where updating a regime to deal with new technology can sometimes subtly and often unintended changes to the original policy setting. So it's something you just need to be alive to when you're responding to developments in your regulatory environment, I guess. Just being careful about how does this change the overall policy approach, and what impacts might it have on the interpretation and application of the older provisions as well.
Yeah, it's interesting too. And as you're saying that, I'm thinking, if you're too specific about some of the kind of the framing of the purpose, and you're having to change that, or at least the environment changes, and therefore it kind of renders it somewhat redundant. That's actually a bit of a sign that maybe there's a bit of a problem in terms of the way that the policy's been framed in the first place, or at least the purpose clause. And maybe you might need to change the operative clauses, but that's a reason to say actually the nature of the policy problem's changed in some senses too. Um, okay, so we might just move on to something really practical. And you will have seen, I think you've probably both seen this, but I'll start with Alison. What's the biggest sign that a purpose clause is compensating for unresolved policy?
You can't flow through to the operative provisions and track just how it's going to be given effect. That's that initial, check to make sure you've got the operative flow through. I think that's the biggest sign for me.
What do you think, Polly?
Um, Obviously, we want legislation to be plain English, but if there are parts of your legislation or your purpose clause that a politician might say, that sounds great, I want to put that in a speech, that might be a signal that potentially it's more, thinking about policy and about maybe rhetorical points as opposed to being something really practical and potentially a bit dry, but limited to what the legislation can actually deliver.
Yeah, well, I guess the other one, in terms of the absolute pinnacle of this, is having situations where a minister or a policy advisors end up in a situation where there's purpose clauses and no operative provisions. It's just a signalling device, and we've certainly seen some examples of that in some of the work we've done over the past several years as well. Um, we've only got time for a few more questions, so let's just take one or two of these. Um, I guess there's an interesting question about when you start to develop a purpose clause. And, in terms of what we've talked about this morning, we've said actually start right at the beginning. I mean, if you're not clear about, from a policy perspective, what the purpose is, and the objectives are and what policy problem you're solving, then there might be a bit of an issue. But I guess, Alison, reflecting on at least the musings of one of our audience members, can it be helpful to do the purpose later in the policy process? Do the groundwork on the operative provisions, then work out how a purpose clause is needed to help application of those operative provisions? What's your view of that?
My thinking is you should probably make a start on it up front because your starting point is your policy problem, as we emphasised earlier. But you need to keep revisiting that throughout the development of your bill, I think, just to make sure you do have that nice alignment with the operative provisions. And sometimes things evolve a little in the way you think about things as you progress through the drafting process as well. So at the very least, a final check to make sure everything is in balance is always a good idea.
It's an interesting point, though, right? I mean, it'd be very easy to think on the basis of our conversation this morning, this is a linear process, and it's not. But you do need to sort of start somewhere. And that applies across a range of different clauses. Do you have a view about this, Polly?
I don't think I've got anything to add to what Alison said.
Right. So I'm going to now turn to whichever one of you is most AI literate.
I suspect it'll be Polly.
And you can choose. Are there examples of AI, particularly Copilot prompts, to help analysts develop purpose and principle clauses?
I do not have any experience in that. I'm sorry.
No, I'm not sure I have anything that is useful to add.
It is an interesting question, though, too, I think, and it's one we probably need to come back to as a committee, in the sense that obviously there's a lot of push to more use AI for some of the work that's being done. Yeah, it's worth thinking a bit more about some of that. So I guess there's a few other questions just in the time we have available. What do you do when a policy team wants a very broad or aspirational purpose clause for signalling reasons, particularly if you happen to be a departmental legal advisor? So I think I'll throw this to Alison first, and then we'll pick up any other further thoughts from Polly. What's your view of that, Alison?
To say this is a pretty common situation. And the starting point is always to separate two different questions. One is whether the policy team wants to signal ambition or direction, and the other is whether the proposed wording will perform a legal function, a useful legal function in the Act. There's nothing inherently wrong with wanting legislation to express an important policy direction, but if the clause is drafted too broadly, as we've talked about already, it can cause problems later, particularly if the operative provisions don't actually support everything the clause seems to promise. So your practical question is to ask what legal work is this wording meant to do, and where in the bill is that work reflected. As always, it's go back to the basics.
What do you think, Polly?
I'd add that's where you as the legal team can be really useful, is to say, well, you can put that in, but here are the risks that you expose yourselves to, and do some hypotheticals to start pushing where that purpose clause might be used against decision makers, potentially in ways that can't be delivered on. The other point I'd make is think about, if there is this really strong desire to be making these policy statements, is there another avenue that it can be channeled towards? Could it be that more aspirational material, can that go in some communications about it? Would the minister like to put that in their speeches, potentially even in Hansard, to talk about why it is that they want to do it? That potentially might then not do as much violence to a purpose provision.
No, it's an interesting thought. I guess one other final thought that occurs to me, I wanted to pick up a point you actually made, Polly, in terms of the Supreme Court case with the Climate Clinic instance. Obviously there were different legal interpretations from the courts in terms of that purpose provision. And obviously the Supreme Court, the ultimate decision maker, or the ultimate opinion, I guess, on all of this came down on one side of that. In those circumstances, not that specific circumstance, but in circumstances like that, what's your view about what should happen legislatively after that? Obviously, there's an outcome that may or may not have been intended. It may or may not have been consistent with where the government was wanting to go, and that can happen in a range of ways. What's your view about the remedy for that?
Well, ultimately, it's in the hands of Parliament. So the courts have done their traditional role of applying the law, and then it's up to Parliament. But I think the really helpful thing that policy teams and departmental legal teams can do is to say, okay, looking at what the court says the interpretation is, if we agree with it, if we don't, can we live with that? Is that something that, from a policy perspective, we want that legislation to mean, and to do that work, and then to put your recommendations up in the normal and ordinary way. So it's the same really with many court decisions about the interpretation of legislation. But then, of course, to do the careful thinking of, well, that purpose provision in the context of a particular case, it might have been about that purpose provision and how it affects a particular decision. So thinking about the TTRL example I gave, it's about marine consents in the exclusive economic zone. But because the purpose provision, of course, applies to the whole Act, think about, well, what does this mean for the other sections in the Act, and are there any flow-on or unanticipated effects there?
Yeah, I guess the thing about it, as you're talking, I'm thinking, well, it's no different to any other provision that might be interpreted. But unfortunately, in this instance, if it then aids the interpretation of the rest of those provisions, then it's probably got more weight. Hey, one last quick question to Alison, which you will have seen, I suspect. Is there a risk that a very carefully drafted purpose clause can make teams overconfident about the coherence of the rest of the bill?
I think that's a very real risk, Guy. So, as I've already stressed, it is always a case of go back to the basics.
Yeah, it's interesting too, right? Overconfidence come from a range of ways of thinking about stuff. So that's all we've got time for today. Thanks for the questions. I hope today's discussion has given you a practical framework for deciding when an express purpose clause or statement of principle will improve a legislative regime and when it may create more problems than it solves. For those of you working in policy and legal teams, the main message is that these are early design questions. They are not for specialist drafters. They go to what the legislation is trying to achieve, how the regime is meant to operate, and which tools best support that design. If you take one thing away from today's webinar, let it be this: use purpose provisions and principles provisions deliberately, not automatically. Be clear about their function, keep them connected to the operative provisions, and test them against what the bill can realistically deliver. And with that summary, can I thank our panel, Alison and Polly, for their contribution today, and thank everyone for being with us. Our short poll should be